Now, the model we use here is the standard model used to introduce students to the literature of growth. And this is the neoclassical or Solow growth model. So this is obviously named after Robert Solow, who is an MIT economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1987. So the Solow growth model works in the following way. So let's just imagine in a particular year, we have a worker, and the worker has some capital, which I would just formalize as a laptop, right? So the worker with his laptop makes money. And what do you do with money? One, you can use money to buy food, buy things that you want, that's consumption. The rest, you save. Now, in the Solow growth model, whatever you save becomes investment into future capital. So when you save money, what happens is in the next year you have more laptops, right? So if you think about this model up till this point, you might think that people would just get richer and richer until they have more than they can possibly consume. But guess what? In this model, you have kids, and for simplicity, kids grow up very quickly, so they're just like become adults in one period. So you best think about this model as like each period is a generation rather than like a actual year. Well, in any case, when your kids grow up, you have to give them something, right? They need capital to work, so you have to give them some capital. So if you're looking at the capital per person, it actually doesn't always go up because there is population growth. So capital is split between the population you have. Right. So now the Solow growth model can be represented by three lines. The first line being this black line that is concave in shape. This line is the production function. It represents how much output you get per worker given the capital per worker. Now notice that in the Solow growth model, everything is in terms of per worker. So you can see that when a worker has more capital, he's more productive, but there is diminishing returns. So he just does not get constant amount of additional productivity from having more capital. Eventually, there's a point where he's not really benefiting from more capital, right? Let's just think about when you have one laptop that makes you productive, but 4 laptops doesn't really make you that much more productive. That's the idea, diminishing returns, right? So we would denote output typically by Y and capital by K, although these symbols are just commonly used in the literature. We aren't really going to deal with much of the math at all. Right, so how do you raise future productivity in this model? Well, what you want to do is you want to save, because if you save, then you're investing your current resources in the production of capital, which would make you more productive in the future in this model. The trade-off obviously is that if you're saving more, then you're having less for consumption today, right? So in this model, savings rate is kind of exogenous, fixed, right? So it's not really something that the agents just endogenously make decision on. So we're just going to take S as a fixed number like 15%. So what happens is that an economy would save 15% of its total output per worker, right? So remember, the everything is expressed per worker, so each worker would be saving 15%, right? And this generates S times Y new capital per worker. So let's just say your output is $100. Then you save 15%, which means you're saving $15. Then next period, you would have $15 worth of new capital. Right, so this can be expressed by the second line, which is in green. This is how much you are saving per worker. Right, it's obviously going to be lower than the black line because the most you can save is 100%, but in that case you probably die because you don't eat. Right, so whatever you save would get turned into new capital. Right, So, as I've already explained, even with positive savings rate, capital per worker does not necessarily goes up because of population growth. You have to give your kids something. Right? Furthermore, there's capital depreciation. That's just a very fancy way of saying that things break down. Right? So now population growth, obviously percentage, like 1% growth or like 2% growth. And depreciation is also in percentage terms. It comes off your value, right? So let's say your laptop is worth $100, next year is probably worth 90 because there's a 10% depreciation. So each year, the economy in total will lose the sum of population growth and depreciation multiplied by the capital you actually have per worker, right? That's how much each worker is losing, right? Once again, remember the model expresses everything per worker. So if each worker has $100 of capital, and then there's a population growth rate of 1%, and there's a depreciation of 3%, that means he loses $4 per year. All right. So now let's take a look in this diagram. There's the third line. This third line is in red and it's linear, upward sloping. This expresses the loss of capital per worker. Now, so the green line tells you how much capital is accumulating. The red line tells you how much capital is being lost. So now the model, you can think about the dynamics of this model. Let's say we're right here, K1, that's how much capital per worker we have in the economy at the moment. You can see that at this point, we are actually saving more than we are losing, right? The green line is higher than the red line. That means that the amount of investment we make is more than enough to compensate for the growth of population and depreciation. That means we'll get richer next period in terms of how much capital we have per worker, right? So the difference between the green line and the red line gets saved and invested. In the next period, there you go, we become richer per person in terms of how much capital per worker. Now you can see that at this point, the green line is once again higher than the red line, although the difference is smaller than before. This means that we are still saving enough to make ourselves richer in the next period. And there you go, richer. And the dynamic continues until we reach a point where the green line intersects the red line. At this point, we are at the point where the savings is just offsetting the loss in capital due to population growth and depreciation, which means at this point, we are not getting richer per worker, right? So whatever we produce just offsets what we need to give to our kids and loss to depreciation. Right, so the stable output per worker is given by the black line, and so what you can notice in this model is when you are poor, you kind of grow faster, right? You can see that in the first period in this model, the difference between the green line and the red line is relatively huge. So the economy is growing relatively quickly. As you get closer and closer to the stable point, you grow slower. Right, so in the slow growth model, poor economies have a higher growth rate than rich economies. Now, why is that the case? Well, first, in the slow growth model, rich and poor are measured in terms of amount of capital per worker. Right, so how many laptops do you have? How many smartphones do you have? That kind of stuff. Right. So, assuming that you have two countries with the same savings rate, then the fact that you're poorer would mean that you grow faster. Right. So that's one possible explanation for why economies like Japan and Hong Kong grew so fast in the last century. Well, you know what? These places were devastated after the Second World War. They were poor, right? When you're poor, you tend to grow fast. Right? Whereas for the United States, you are already developed and relatively, well, safe, right, throughout the World War. So you don't get to grow so fast because there's less capital destruction that has happened. Right. In the long run, in the solo growth model, economies grow at a stable rate. That means that the new capital per worker just offsets the old capital loss per worker. So that doesn't mean the economy is not growing. It just means that it's not growing per person. The economy as a whole can still be growing due to population growth, right? For economies with similar savings rate and population growth, their output should eventually converge. Now, so many years down the road, you would expect perhaps China's growth rate was slow to the level of developed countries. Well, certainly you can see the growth rate of Japan and to a certain extent Hong Kong is a lot slower than they used to be, right? So that is something that solo growth model can explain, because these places have already gotten richer, so it's harder to save and invest so much such that you keep growing so fast. Now, what about China? Now, one thing you can notice here is that China has really high savings rate. We're talking about 40% or 50% savings rate, right? Whereas in the United States and Sub-Saharan Africa, it's like just around 20%. Now, you might ask, okay, is the United States actually saving 20%? That's a good question. If you're talking about individuals, no. Individuals in the United States do not have 20% savings rate. What we're talking about here is the whole economy as a whole. So despite the fact that individuals in the United States are not really saving, the government is borrowing, corporations, the corporate sector in the United States, the private sector, they do save a lot. Like, I believe Apple has somewhere around like 200 billion in cash, right? So that's saving, right? So the economy as a whole has savings. It's just not like perhaps not individuals and not the government, right? More troubling, you would see, is the fact that Sub-Saharan Africa is not really saving a lot, right? At least not as high as China. One thing you might ask is why China has such a high savings rate. There could be various reasons, right? For example, it could be due to the one-child policy, so you think that you need to save up for your retirement. Or another possibility is the fact that real estate is very expensive in China, and the cultural norm just expect that a son, like a male, would have some sort of real estate before they marry. So parents might be saving up for their child, right? So that's another possibility. Right, so in this model, savings rate is kind of just a number that is fixed. So we can ask what happens if you have higher savings rate. If you have higher savings rate, then you can see that the green line is higher in the diagram, which means that you are saving and investing more in any given period. Now, what would that mean? That means first that your capital is accumulating faster. And second, that means that you can sustain a higher equilibrium because you're saving and investing more, so you can afford to have a higher capital per worker, because and still be able to offset loss to population growth and depreciation, right? So you can see that the capital per person in this economy is higher when the savings rate is higher, right? So in this case, because each worker has more capital, that also means that they're higher stable output, right? So higher savings rate, more rapid growth in GDP. So in the long run, higher savings rate means higher level of productivity, right? So you can see that the stable point moves towards right. Higher level of income, that's given by the black line, but it's not high growth, right? In the end, once your savings rate cancels out with the population growth and depreciation, what you have is that your economy grows at the rate of population growth. One thing to note is that higher stable output is not the same as higher consumption. The reason is that, well, you might be saving too much. So let's take a look at this example. Now, in when you have the savings rate is relatively low at S1, then you can see that the consumption is the vertical distance between the black line and the green line as indicated by this blue arrow, right? Now, if you save more S2, at the level of S2, then you can see that the difference actually shrink. Because the more you save, the more you have, the more you have, the more you stand to lose. So while everyone is richer, quote unquote, in terms of capital per worker, then the actual things that we care, namely consumption, actually might go down. So it's not necessarily better to have a higher savings rate if you think that what matters in the end is what you actually consume. Because of this reason, there is actually an optimal savings rate which gives you the highest consumption, right? This is called the golden rule savings ratio, right? So if the goal is to maximize consumption in the long run, then the solo growth model suggests there's actually an optimal savings rate. And ultimately, the reason is due to diminishing return. Too much capital is unproductive. Why would you need 4 laptops when 1 would already be sufficient, right? With 4 laptops, you have more things to break down. So the optimal savings rate depends on how productive the economy is, the rate of population growth, and capital depreciation. Now, from the perspective of developing your economy, what you might want is to have high savings rate initially because that makes your economy grow fast. But eventually, you want to lower your savings rate to maintain a relatively high consumption. So this would suggest that ideally what you should have is a high savings rate when your country is poor and followed by a lower savings rate when your country is well developed. Do we see that? Well, to a certain extent, savings rate is declining in places like United States. On the other hand, it's going up in China, despite the fact that China has become a lot richer than before. So it's interesting to know why China has this particular pattern. Another trend is economies tend to have lower population growth as they mature. This is very obvious for China, which initially was due to the one-child policy, but in recent years, China's birth rate has been lower than the United States, and you can see that population growth is actually slower in China than the United States for quite some while. On the other hand, you have Sub-Saharan Africa, which maintains a really high population growth rate basically throughout history. What does the solo growth model has to say with regard to population growth? Well, population growth enters the diagram through the red line, where if you have more kids, then you have to give them computers, so everyone becomes poorer. So a lower population growth rate would result in a lower red line. And if you look at the diagram, this would mean a richer equilibrium, right? So the capital per worker goes up. And in this case, because the savings rate remains the same, this higher, wealthier equilibrium is also associated with higher consumption. So in the solo growth model, lower population growth is a good thing because it makes everyone richer and allows everyone to have more to eat. So all else equal, an economy with low population growth gets rich faster because of less mouths to feed. That gives you more money for investment. It will also have a higher stable output and higher stable consumption. So the slow growth model gives you rationale for population control policies because lower population growth makes you richer and allows you to consume more. If you read the news, there is certain truth to this. One of Africa's biggest problem is its uncontrolled population growth. When your population doubled over 15 years, when a woman average have more than 5 children, you can't really talk about economic development or any development to speak of, right? What are you supposed to do when your population is growing so fast? Your schools can't keep up, your hospitals can't keep up, there's not enough housing. There's simply not much you can do, so getting population under control is important. Finally, let's talk about productivity growth. Now, in the solo growth model, productivity growth is represented by a higher black line, which represents the production function. So you're more productive, then you're producing more given the capital per worker you have, right? So so a higher black line would also comes with a higher green line for the same savings rate. So everything goes up. So what does that mean? What that means is that because you're now more productive and you're also saving more, then you can sustain a a wealthier equilibrium. So you have more capital per worker in equilibrium. And because the black line, the production is also higher, consumption also goes up. So productivity growth is a good thing. We can produce more with the same stuff we have, so we all get to be richer and consume more. So productivity growth makes an economy richer because of faster capital accumulation and higher stable consumption. And where do you get those? Technological improvement and education. So that's why you want a country to invest in research and development. So how meaningful is the slow growth model? Well, it does explain the growth of currently rich countries, since every country was poor once upon a time, right? So we know how countries become rich throughout time. What it cannot do is to explain difference in growth rate among countries with similar income and population growth rates, right? So this is due to the fact that the model is very simple, right? But it's a good starting point. This is a reason why it's taught in undergraduate level, because it's a simple model and it conveys the ideas that you want to convey very well. Right, for the time we have left, we just going to briefly talk about monetary economics. To understand modern monetary economics, we need to examine the relationship between several interlinked factors. First, there's the central bank, which everyone pay attention to, like the Federal Reserve or the People's Bank of China. Central banks typically have policy targets, like keeping unemployment rate low or keeping inflation in check. But despite the fact that the central bank have such targets, they can't directly affect these things because, well, that is not a free economy, right? In a planned economy, maybe you can try to mandate how many people get employed, but not in a free economy. Inflation is affected by price level because inflation, by definition, is an increase in price level. Unemployment rate is affected by investment and spending because you need companies investing and people spending money in order for people to get hired, right? No spending, no work. Price level is affected by money supply. Well, because if there are more money floating around, then money become less worthy, right? So things get expensive and there will be inflation. Interest rate affects investment and spending because when people invest, they look at what return they get, and people spend money. If people spend money, then they're not putting money in the bank, which pays interest. So the interest rate and money supply are also interrelated. So central banks can affect interest rate and monetary supply through certain tools they have. So this is what they're going to do in order to reach their policy targets of controlling unemployment rates and inflation. Interest rate and price level also affects exchange rate. So, right, because a country's so this is actually very obvious in Hong Kong, because whenever the interest rate in the United States is noticeably higher than Hong Kong, money starts flowing towards the United States, and that affects the exchange rate between Hong Kong dollars and US dollars. So now in macroeconomics, there are two models that you might come across. One is the ADAS model, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is a model that has to do with price level. And there's another model called ISOM model, which has to do with interest rate. Now, one thing we need to make clear is that Hong Kong actually has no monetary policy. The reason is that Hong Kong dollar is essentially pegged to US dollars. It's not exactly pegged, it's linked, which means that the Hong Kong dollar can, the exchange rate can flow within a narrow band. It's between $7.35 cents to $1 to $7.85 to $1, right? So it's slightly floating, but pretty much it's like packed. Whenever you have two currencies that have a fixed exchange rate, then the smaller side in terms of the size of the economy would have very little leeway in controlling its monetary policy. Well, the reason is that when, let's say, the Federal Reserve lower interest rate in the United States, then if Hong Kong does not follow, then you'll be flooded by money coming from the United States. And when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, and if Hong Kong does not follow, then money flow out of Hong Kong. If you want to maintain the peg, right? If you want the exchange rate to be stable, then Hong Kong has to follow the interest rate of the United States. Otherwise, this flow of money would just keep continuing. So this is why Hong Kong has no monetary policy. We pretty much cannot control our interest rate unless we are willing to just let the linked exchange rate go. So money supply. There are various measures of money supply. The most important ones for monetary economics are M0 or MB, which is the monetary base, basically cash. M1 is highly liquid asset like cash plus check deposits plus traveler checks, things that you can easily convert to money. And M2 is somewhat liquid asset, so M1 plus saving deposits, small-time deposits, money market funds, things that are slightly less liquid but still liquid enough that you can easily convert to cash if you need to. So how central bank control money supply? Now, central bank can directly increase money supply by printing money, like literally printing. But this is very rare unless you are in a country which is in serious financial trouble, like Zimbabwe. Like if your government have absolutely no money and you have to pay your civil servants, then what do? Print money. The thing is, if you do that, then since you're creating money out of nowhere, people eventually realize that these money actually don't worth anything, and they would raise prices, and you have this endless cycle of games where the government keeps trying to print more money, and then people keep trying to raise their prices further, and what you end up with is like this: $100 trillion in a single banknote, and that doesn't even buy you a cup of coffee. So in developed countries, typically, central bank controls the money supply through open market operations. So basically, you buy and sell government bonds with money created out of thin air. The money, since the transactions are actually electronic, you don't actually need to print money, right? Things just go digital. If the central bank says, look, I have that much money, then it does have that much money, right? So there's an additional way where the central bank can affect the interest rate it offers to commercial banks. In the US, this is called the discount window. This is not as commonly used. So this is not, as a policy tool, this is not as important as open market operation. Right, so when the central bank creates one additional dollar, so this is an increase in the monetary base, M0, MB. Money supply would actually increase by more than one due to what we call the multiplier effect. Now, in this diagram, you can see that the M1 and M2 of the United States, and you can see M2 clearly goes up much faster and goes down much faster than M1. This is because commercial banks can lend out money in the deposit, and this would exhibit the effect of increasing and decreasing money supply. Right. For example, if the central bank gives you $100, which you deposit in the bank, and if the bank lends $80 to me, then, well, if you include the M2, which includes saving deposits, would actually increase by 180, not 100, right? So this process is called credit creation. Banks typically are not allowed to lend out everything in the deposit. That's probably not a good practice, right? What if people want their money back? So the less they lend out, the smaller is the overall money supply. So this is one way that central banks can actually control money supply. You can, by adjusting the reserve ratios. The People's Bank of China does that once in a while. Now, in the extreme case where banks are not allowed to lend out any deposit, then there's no credit creation, so money supply only increased by the rate at which the central bank creates money, but then you're basically removing the whole banking system. So this never happens. The proportion of deposit banks need to keep is called reserve ratio, and this is what central banks very often just once in a while to affect the money supply. The ratio where the money supply, or like M2, over the monetary base, M0, is called the money multiplier. This ratio tells you how much money supply would change when the central bank creates $1. So the central bank creates $1 out of the thin air, and then the economy after a while would probably have something like perhaps $2. So this is all the time we have, so we're just going to conclude money is a good, right? So which means it is affected by demand supply, and there is a price for money, right? Interest is the price of money, right? If you want money, you can borrow. You have to pay a price. What is the price? Interest. When central bank increase money supply, price of money goes down just like any other good. More supply, lower price. So when the central bank increase money supply, interest rate goes down. This is the link between money supply and interest rate.